Hi, this is Chandra. This is my podcast, mainly focusing on the data and AI, and I'm glad to have Kasturi as part of my podcast. Kasturi, if you can just introduce yourself to our audience, I'd really appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Chandra, for having me. My name is Kasturi Golla, and I currently work for Wells Fargo. I head up their non-financial risk reporting and analytics team. I've spent about 19 years of my career in the financial industry, primarily in my early days. Spent a lot of time in the home lending and consumer lending technology, trying to understand the mortgage process, and also got my exposure to data-driven decisioning. Had the pleasure of being part of the data team to really drive out the data foundation framework that really helps to drive out our reporting and analytics platforms. In my role today, I have the pleasure of leading a group of individuals that do reporting and analytics for our non-financial risk data, but also have the pleasure now of really exploring the opportunities that AI brings to the bank, but most importantly, always thinking about it from a risk management perspective.
You've been a role model for a lot of the people that I have known, so I'm so glad that you're part of my podcast today, Kasturi.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And we can. I just want to start off with your journey, right? At least maybe just if you can let our audience know how you've gotten into this industry. And I know you've been with the banking sector for almost like 25 years now.
My undergraduate education and my master's is in information technology, right? Or more popularly known as management information systems. Right. And so I started out in the insurance industry actually as a systems analyst, and later moved into the financial sector, of course, primarily focusing a lot in the home lending space. Right. Again, it was around application development. And so my first exposure to large banks was around their home lending mortgage process, right? Refinance, what does it mean for a first-time home buyer to apply for the loan? The process, the data involved, what does it mean to refinance a loan? And so that's how I started my journey. And in retrospect now, when I think about it, I think my initial focus was around, of course, the systems and the applications and how they all interact, and understanding the customer's interaction with the system, and how do you translate user requirements into system requirements. But in retrospect now, I think it was also my first exposure to really understand the power of data. And fast forward many years into my career, I actually had the opportunity to really push for data-driven decisioning solutions. And large banks, as you might very well be aware, have a lot of data, right? We have an abundant amount of data, but don't necessarily have the greatest processes or the insights that we're drawing from the data. And so data-driven decisioning, I think, was sort of my first exposure into the power of data and how we could really drive and help customer interactions and really improve the customer experience. And then, of course, in my current role, it is all about leveraging data and analytics, advanced analytics, and now even thinking about AI as well, right? Of course, from a bank's perspective, more importantly, when you start talking about AI, what does that mean from a risk management lens? And then that's really where I'm spending a lot of my focus. I think I've gotten to this point and really appreciated the value that data brings to an organization, but also I'm very, very optimistic about the future in regards to how the new tools and technologies can really help organizations mature around their risk management, mature around their customer experience journeys.
One of the aspects that I would like to, put focus on right now is mainly for the banking sector, right? For the banking industry, since it's a very, regulated environment. And with all the changes for the technology, like if you see at least for the last 3-4 years, you've seen changes even on a daily basis, right? 3 years back, nobody ever knew what ChatGPT was. We knew there was something AI called AI, right, and machine learning, but nothing of what we were anticipating that would take place, right? With all being in the regulated industry and all the risks that's involved, what is your take on that, and what is that you see, happening, in the industry today?
Absolutely, and I think that's wonderful that you asked that. It's very exciting because there are a lot of, again, new technologies available. And so I think there's some amazing use cases that large banks can leverage immediately, right? Like a chat GPT type feature in your branches, right? How powerful is that to help the tellers, right? Or the branch officers, right? Instead of sieving through thousands and thousands of pages of policy, right? So a chat GPT type feature is excellent for them, right? So right now, I think large banks are in the midst of trying to determine what are those use cases that AI can be applied to, but also the challenge that large banks have is to really also make sure that we are balancing the expectations of the regulators. So when you talk about the financial sector and the banking industry, and you mentioned highly regulated, I think there's some use cases that are going to be more easily acceptable and more easily adaptable, right, from an AI perspective. But for some of the more complex proprietary data type use cases, I think there is still a ways for large banks to go, or banks in general, before there is a comfort level around what are these models producing and how are the regulators going to receive these models. And so it's definitely, when you banking industry, every conference is one of the key topics is leveraging AI. So it's very much top of mind for everyone in the bank. But we also, I think, have to be very, very cautious in regards to which use cases should be put forward, right? And where AI makes the most sense. But it is a theme that is going to carry through for at least the next 3 to 5 years. Mm-hmm. This will definitely be the hot topic on a lot of tables. Anytime goal setting is upon us, I foresee for the next 3 to 5 years, this will definitely be the hot topic on the table.
Can you give us one of your use cases? When we talk about regulations, right? That's always an interesting side of it, which I think for someone who's not part of the financial industry, right? It's always one of those areas where we would like to know how the regulations come into effect, right? Whenever there's a change in the technology, there's always this huge risk that they have to look into, right? If you can maybe share one of your use cases that you have to recently look into, where AI played an important role.
Absolutely. So one thing, when you think about banks in general, the customer experience is very, very critical, right? And so complaints is a huge agenda item for banks, right? Whether they're internal complaints, whether they're actually customer complaints, right? And so one use case that we're exploring, actually in the process of exploring, is just looking at internal feedback, right, from our own employees, right, in terms of what is not working, right? Whether it's processes, whether it's procedures, whether it's technology, right? What is not working for us? What can we do better? And so that is where we're trying to leverage the power of AI, look at or scan through all of the data that is being received in various different formats to say, what are some themes that folks are trying to tell us, and also trying to help decision making around where would it give us the most value add back to our own employees to invest time and effort in these themes. And so that is a use case that is currently being worked on as well. Again, in the context of complaints, when you mentioned regulators, the CFPB is a very important government organization that banks are answerable to. And the CFPB actually logs complaints, public complaints, that are available for anyone to Google and look at. And so where companies are spending time also is trying to analyze how is our reputation, right, being impacted by complaints that are publicly available from CSPB, right? So that's another use case that we've started to talk about, and we'll be prioritizing shortly.
Now that AI is in place, how is that impacting the overall decision making?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it really varies, right? When you think about banks, right, and you think about your typical sort of organizational structures, right? You have your IT organization and then you have your business organization, right? I think when it comes to AI, whether it's driven by IT leadership or whether it's driven by business leadership, I think there are some what I would consider vanilla use cases that are great candidates, right? Where to put it mildly, where can we get the bang for the buck? Right? There are definitely a lot of manual processes that exist in banks, especially banks that over the years may have acquired other banks, other businesses. So they're perfect candidates to eliminate manual processes, right? I think where a lot of the organizations are struggling today is when it comes to really embracing AI from a risk management perspective. What is the output of how reliable is the output from an AI model? Not only in terms of how can it help to drive action and insight, but can we defend the output to the decision makers on a consistent basis? And more importantly, can we defend the output to our regulators, right? That is where organizations are, I think, very cautious in stepping into use cases, right? If you talk about use cases, I think there are an abundant amount of use cases that I think AI can solve. But I also, from a risk management perspective, also step back and say, I don't think our models today are going to solve world peace, right? There's some great use cases that I think we will be able to avoid manual processes and really bring back efficiencies that companies are looking for. But there are also, I think, several use cases that, although might seem like great candidates, I think have to be vetted from a risk perspective. Really, I think also back to the companies that are providing these LLMs, right, is I think challenge back to them to say, how can we with confidence justify the output of your model and justify the output to regulators? And that's going to be the question that leaders are going to be asked, and I think industry providers are going to be asked as well to partner to get there.
How do you also balance the empathy and just not the efficiency, right? So how do you make sure there's also a certain empathy towards the consumer satisfaction?
Absolutely, and huge. When you look at the vision statement of a lot of the big banks today, customer satisfaction, right, is first and foremost. I mean, of course, everybody does this to make a profit, right? But at the end of the day, it's all about the customer satisfaction. It's all about the reputation. Right? It is a balancing act for sure. And that's where I think companies will continue to challenge, learn and challenge, right? Learn what is feasible and where the gains can be quickly gotten from an efficiency standpoint. Like I said, there might be many manual processes, right, that could very well easily be automated with AI. right? Maybe your chat GPT type functionality, right? When it comes to searching reports or searching through policy documents, it's very much manual today, right? There are definitely gains to be had. But balancing efficiency for sure, I think for the more complicated use cases, in addition to efficiency, I think the validity and the accuracy of the outcome has to be balanced, right? And most importantly, I think most banks will attest to the fact that the reputation and the customer satisfaction trump everything, right? So I think they can live with manual processes for a while, as long as there is no negative impact to the customer sentiment, so to speak. But it's evolving. It's a very exciting time in the industry because the thought process is evolving, the tools are evolving, and I think customer mindset is evolving, because if you look at the generation of people that bank, there are certain tools and capabilities that are catered, I think, to the now generation, right? And so I think that thought process is also evolving. So banks are evolving in terms of their strategies around what tools and how do we roll them out from a branch perspective versus an online or web perspective. So it's a very exciting time, but it's also very challenging to make sure that we are providing that balance. And most importantly, I think at the end of the day, it all comes down to justifying the solutions and the outcomes to our regulators.
One of the other things that I want to bring it up today is mainly when it comes to the banking sector, right? How are you looking at the trust and innovations in the financial AI modules?
For sure. I think when I think about maybe the last even 10 years, right, and I shared a little bit about my background, there was a point in time when the financial industry went through, everything has to be built. Everything has to be built. We have to custom build solutions for ourselves, right? And then they went through a time where there was always this conversation around build versus buy, right? What makes the most sense based on the use case or the need that is posed. The trend now is definitely leaning towards, I have solutions available, right? I have solutions available. I have AI solutions available. We have a lot of companies now in the market that can come in as enablers, right? And so a lot of the mindset shift for banks and leadership is, why do we have to build custom solutions, right? Why not rely on companies coming in and help to jumpstart our journey for us, right? Why not take advantage of these enablers? And why not learn about the AI solutions that are available? So there is definitely a lot of openness to, I call it test and learn, but that might be pilot. Test and learn opportunities with vendors, right? That may have solutions to solve problems, right? Now, are they all going to be AI solutions? Maybe is the question. And like I mentioned earlier, I think there's some great use cases that are, I would call vanilla or base level use cases, where AI solutions will bring a lot of efficiency and definitely remove manual processes today, right? Reduce errors, help banks maybe gain more efficiency when it comes to their risk and control environment, right? Which is where the focus is today. So that is definitely how I see sort of the trend now. And I think in terms of just the roles, when it comes to roles, I think your traditional data analyst role is also evolving. And I think banks recognize that, and they think of them more in the context of data scientists or analytical scientists, right? Where it's no longer just about getting the data, right, or packaging the data. It really is around, how can I leverage the data, the right data, identifying the right data to help my leadership drive meaningful insights. So I definitely see a shift as well in how we think about folks with the data analyst titles. There's a huge focus around analytics, mining the data, right? Trying to draw insights from the data. So I think it's, like I said, it is a very exciting time, I think, for banks, the mindset shift leadership, but also for individuals that I think like and appreciate data and want to help to draw insights from the data.
You brought up, using some existing tools, right? If the job can be done in using some of the existing tools, that's a great way to go. At the same time, mainly for a banking sector, right? When you start using the tools or automation, how do you measure the accountability, Kasturi?
Absolutely. I think no different than when I think about some of the traditional modeling that we do, whether it's SAS or Python. The amount of scrutiny that goes into developing, peer reviewing, testing the model, right? I think the same level of accountability and transparency has to apply to these AI models. Now, with traditional models, of course, the processes have been around for a lot longer. The AI model usage is still evolving. And so banks are still trying to understand again which use cases are maybe more mature to take through the process, and are the learnings of the models at a point where we can trust the outcomes, right? So it is ever evolving, but when it comes to leveraging AI models, I honestly don't see that big of a difference around the due diligence and the scrutiny that we apply to traditional models today in the banking sector. That being said, I think we have a huge opportunity to speed up the process, right? And speed up the process. And that's where I think the AI models may be able to help to give us a better baseline quicker, right? Something that you can work with quicker as opposed to your traditional model development life cycle. But the same level of scrutiny will have to be applied, especially when you start thinking about it from a risk management perspective.
What are some of the measures that the banking industry as a whole is taking for the risk mitigation, right? So,
In terms of models, yeah. So they've most banks, I think, have this in place. Again, it varies by bank, but most banks will stand up what they call an AI council, right? And it is meant to be a centralized approach to really manage, govern the use, right, and delivery of AI models. So most banks, I think, are along their journey. Some may be a little ahead of the others, but most of them follow the pattern of having an AI council. Now, what the council also is responsible for is to make sure they are putting into place guardrails around how much training can individual consumers of the data do around the models. And I think that's very critical, especially from a risk management perspective, right? So there is definitely work that needs to be done in terms of understanding the more complex use cases. But most banks are treating, I think, AI model adoption as being governed and managed by a central strategic vision in order to make sure that the same message is getting delivered across the enterprise.
Kasturi, one of the other things which I think is very important for any industry is voice of the customer. What are some of the important measures that the banking sector as a whole is taking today to ensure that there's always voice of the customer?
Absolutely. If you think about the journey for some of the big banks, right, and you think about maybe the news articles that come up, reputation and customer satisfaction are big priorities, right? And when you think about some of the big players in the market today, from a branch perspective, right, a branch presence, a lot of focus is given to making sure there is a branch presence and making sure customers feel comfortable approaching the branches, right? and also the feedback, right, from the customers is very, very critical. So majority of the large banks today, I mean, they do use frequent surveys, right, that go out and are measured. There are key performance indicators in place, and again, are rolled up at the very top, and then of course each department, right, tracks their own key performance indicators. But there are metrics that are reviewed on a quarterly basis around satisfaction, right, around the business process. How easy was it for the customer to do A, B, or C, right? And these scores are reviewed and taken very seriously, right? They're taken very seriously. Their action and accountability plans that are put into place. I think it all has to do again with the fact that the bottom line matters, but it's all about customer satisfaction, and it's all about the reputation. I think the reputation and the customer satisfaction go hand in hand. And so there is a lot of time spent from senior leadership meeting the communities, right? Visiting branches, meeting the community, hearing from community leaders around what is working for them, what is not working for them, where can banks still make a difference for the communities. And so there's metrics and KPIs that are looked at on a quarterly basis and actioned on.
No, thank you so much, and I really appreciate you coming here for the podcast today. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you for having me.